using the accessibility provisions in NCC Volume 1, NCC Tutor Series. The focus of this presentation is on the NCC provisions for access for people, including those with a disability, in Volume 1 of the NCC. This module is best viewed with a copy of the NCC on hand. To access the NCC, visit abcb.gov.au and register, or log in to freely access it. Understanding the NCC accessibility provisions. Before we go on with the rest of the presentation, let's take a moment to understand what accessibility means, both generally and in the context of the NCC. The accessibility provisions in NCC Volume 1 are designed to ensure buildings are designed and constructed in a way to ensure that most people can access them. This includes access for people with a disability, such as a visual or vision impairment, hearing impairment, physical or mobility-related disability, brain injury, cognitive or intellectual disability, and mental health conditions. However, it's not just people with disability who experience barriers to accessing and using buildings. Potential barriers to access may affect anyone, both people with and without disability. Good access has benefits for all people. For example, families with small children, people with temporary injuries, and anyone delivering or picking up goods. Let's consider 3 examples of how a person's needs can affect building design. The absence of contrast on stair nosings makes stairs more hazardous for all users, but especially for people with visual impairments. A stepped entrance creates a barrier for people who use wheelchairs and other people with impaired mobility, such as sore knees and hips. A place with amplified sound, such as a theatre or conference venue, can challenge people's ability to hear clearly. In Australia, anti-discrimination laws exist to protect people with a disability from discrimination. The definition of disability shown here in this excerpt from the Commonwealth Disability Discrimination Act 1992, or DDA, is very broad and covers about 20% of Australians. Accessibility provisions have existed in the Code since 1990. The chief focus of the NCC's accessibility provisions is on commercial and public buildings, i.e. Class 3 and Class 5 to 9 buildings. There are some requirements for certain Class 1B and Class 10 buildings and structures, and parts of Class 2 buildings. The terms accessible and accessway are both defined terms in the NCC, and these definitions are found in Schedule 3 of all NCC volumes. Although the Code has had accessibility requirements since 1990, there were inconsistencies between the Code requirements and the DDA. This led to uncertainty for the building industry, including developers, designers, builders, and certifiers. As a consequence, there were a number of successful DDA complaints about code-compliant buildings. To address the inconsistencies between building law and the DDA, the Commonwealth Government resolved to develop a disability standard covering buildings, which would be reflected in the Code when completed. The Code was updated in 2011 as a result. The NCC accessibility provisions reflect the requirements of the Disability Access to Premises Buildings Standards 2010, known as the Premises Standards. The Premises Standards were developed to provide certainty in relation to the levels of access to public buildings would satisfy the general non-discrimination requirements of the DDA. They provide a uniform set of requirements that apply both in relation to non-discriminatory access under the DDA and in relation to the requirements for access that must be complied with in order to obtain building approval under building law. What are the NCC accessibility provisions? The NCC sets out the minimum performance requirements for the provision of safe, equitable, and dignified access to buildings. The overall access objectives are to ensure, as much as possible, that people can access and use buildings safely, equitably, and with dignity. This includes access to services and facilities within a building. It also includes that buildings provide a continuous accessible path of travel, i.e. one that does not include features that might impede safe, equitable, and dignified movement and access to facilities. This includes travel to a building, within a building, and leaving a building. Examples of adhering to the access principles include Accessible entry to a new building must be the principal pedestrian entrance and not one around the back of the building. It also includes gaining access to a swimming pool should not rely on someone having to be carried into it. While there are some exceptions and exemptions within the NCC, access is required to most spaces and facilities within a building used by the occupants, who may be customers, visitors, or staff. The NCC is mainly concerned with the physical construction of the building. Generally speaking, what happens after construction in terms of fit-out and ongoing use and management are not covered by the NCC, but continue to be covered by discrimination law. The NCC does not address these three areas. Fixtures and fittings used in a building, such as furniture or reception desks. It doesn't include wayfinding information, such as room numbers or general information signs, and it also does not address management policies or staff behaviour. For example, if the staff at a nightclub refuse to allow a blind person entry. So it is important to comply with the accessibility provisions in the NCC so that a building is built in such a way as to be accessible to as many people as possible. Let's look at some practical examples of how accessibility applies to a building from the allotment boundary, between associated buildings that are required to be accessible. The next is between levels via lifts, ramps and stairs. In most buildings, to all areas normally used by the users, to signage, including braille and tactile, to hearing augmentation services, and finally, to suitable sanitary facilities. NCC Volume 1 contains a number of sections with requirements relevant to accessibility. It is easier to look at the table of contents and see that Section D is relevant, but you need to look beyond this to identify the other provisions in other sections. For accessibility, there are a total of 9 performance requirements across 3 sections of NCC Volume 1, which are Sections D, E and F, 4 verification methods across Sections D, E and F, 35 DTS provisions across 4 sections, which are Sections D, E, F and H, and 4 specifications across Sections D, E and F. The performance requirements represent minimum requirements. Building owners, designers and builders can choose to introduce additional or alternative measures to provide greater accessibility within a building and to its occupants. For example, a care home or day centre for people with disabilities. Section A, Governing Requirements, is common across the NCC and covers how to use and apply the NCC itself. The various parts of Section A can apply to accessibility. For example, Part A1, Interpreting the NCC, describes how to interpret provisions within the NCC, including things like application statements, limitation statements, and exception statements. Part A5, Documentation of Design and Construction, describes the requirements for evidence and documentation to prove compliance with relevant access performance requirements. Part A6, Building Classifications, describes the building classes which in part determine which accessibility provisions apply to a building or part of a building. Part A7 describes the treatment of united buildings which can have implications for accessibility requirements. The 3 main sections of NCC Volume 1 containing performance requirements related to accessibility are Section D, Access and Egress, which focuses on how people enter, leave and move around the building. This obviously has implications for the ease with which people with disabilities can access and move around the building and how they can evacuate from the building in the event of emergencies. This has 7 performance requirements relevant to access for people with disability, as well as 2 relevant verification methods, plus 12 parts containing DTS provisions and 2 relevant specifications. Section E, Services and Equipment, which contains provisions related to the use of lifts for evacuation of people with disability. It has 1 relevant performance requirement, 1 verification method, 3 DTS provisions, and 1 relevant specification. Section F, Health and Amenity, which contains provisions related to the provision of sanitary facilities that are accessible. It has one performance requirement, one verification method, 5 DTS provisions, and one relevant specification. Section G contains ancillary provisions. These are specific provisions that can impact on access that apply in limited circumstances. Part G3 applies to atrium construction and includes additional DTS provisions to ensure safe access and egress. Part G4 relates to construction in alpine areas and contains additional performance requirements and DTS provisions that impact on access and egress. And Part G6, occupiable outdoor areas, includes an inclusion of an occupiable outdoor area in the definition of a story, potentially impacting on passenger lifts and access paths. Additional requirements for specific applications and building uses are also contained in Section H, Special Use Buildings. This contains 15 additional DTS provisions that can apply to only Class 9B or Class 10 public transport buildings, as detailed here. Section H does not contain any performance requirements, only DTS provisions. These provisions within Part H2, Public Transport Buildings, derive from the Disability Standards for Accessible Public Transport 2002. This is a national disability standard agreed to by Australian governments. The design specification in the Disability Standard for Accessible Public Transport 2002 is sometimes different to those that generally apply within the NCC. As a result, Part H2 sometimes refers to different editions of Australian standards for things like accessways, ramps, stairways, signage, lifts and doorways. If there is a difference between some aspects of a DTS provision in Part H2 and some aspect of a related provision in another section of the NCC, then the provision within Part H2 takes precedence. In broad terms, Section D requires buildings to allow for safe movement into, out of, and within a building. It primarily addresses access and car parking, movement to and within a building, and safe evacuation during an emergency. All the performance requirements for Section D are at the front of the section. There are 9 in total. The names pretty well define what they are about. 7 of these are relevant to access for people with disabilities. Section D also describes 4 verification methods which may be used as performance solutions to assess compliance with part or all of the performance requirements of Section D. 2 of these verification methods are relevant to access for people with disability. Verification method DV2 provides a way to verify that a building provides safe and equitable access to and within a building. It verifies compliance with DP1, DP2 and DP6, as well as EP 3.4 and or FP 2.1. The next is the verification method DV3, and it provides a way to verify compliance with DP2 to provide safe movement to and within the building via ramps used by wheelchairs. Remember, a verification method is just one way to verify compliance via a performance solution. The relevant deemed to satisfy provisions in Section D are contained in Part D3, Access for People with a Disability. A number of these provisions apply differently in different building classifications. Some points that you need to consider include D3.1 contains general building access requirements, while D3.2 specifies the extent of access that must be provided to buildings. Different classes of buildings may have different access requirements. For example, an office building, Class 5, would generally require access to all areas normally used by the occupants, whereas hotels, Class 3, would only require access to common areas of the building and some of the hotel rooms and units, but not all. D3.3 specifies access ways within buildings. D3.4 contains a number of exemptions for providing access. D3.6 covers access signage, while D3.7 specifies requirements for systems to assist with those with hearing impairments. D3.8 specifies requirements for tactile indicators to assist people with visual or vision impairment to avoid hazardous situations. D3.9 specifies requirements for wheelchair seating spaces within Class 9B assembly buildings, for example, a sporting stadium. D3.11 specifies requirements for ramps that are part of a designated accessway. And D2.12 contains specified requirements for glazing within an accessway. There are also two specifications supporting the accessibility provisions in Section D, which is Specification D 3.6, Braille and Tactile Signs, and D 3.10, Accessible Water Entry/Exit for Swimming Pools. Specifications contain detailed information to apply the relevant DTS provisions. Tactile means relating to our sense of touch. A tactile sign is one that you can touch in order to gain information from it. Let's look at the performance requirements for accessibility in Section D. As you can see here, there are 4 performance requirements: DP1, DP6, DP7 and DP9. One thing to remember about performance requirements is that they will be either qualitative or quantitative. A qualitative performance requirement specifies an attribute that must be achieved, whereas a quantitative performance requirement will specify a value that provides an absolute measure of performance. Let's look at DP1, Access for People with a Disability. DP1 essentially specifies that people with a disability must be able to access a building and be able to access work and public spaces and sanitary facilities within the building. The term, to the degree necessary, shows that this performance requirement is qualitative in nature. It gives you the flexibility in implementation and recognises that different degrees of access may be required for different buildings. Section A Governing Requirements provides further details of what this means in respect to meeting a performance requirement. The terms accessible and access ways, shown here in blue italics, are defined terms in the NCC. Accessible means having features to enable use by people with a disability. Examples include absence of steps and other level changes, use of ramps, automatic doors, wider doorways and accessways, tactile signage, lift buttons and maps, and hearing loops. Accessway means a continuous accessible path of travel as defined in AS 1428.1 to, into or within a building. AS 1428.1 designed for access and mobility general requirements for access, new building work, incorporating amendments 1 and 2. Note the limitation for DP1. It does not apply to a Class 4 part of a building. There's also an ACT appendix. This appendix contains variations and additions to the NCC that apply to building work undertaken in the ACT, and information about the application of the NCC in the ACT. DB6, Paths of Travel to Exits. This is about ensuring that all occupants can safely exit a building. This is a qualitative performance requirement. Note the words appropriate to. The critical factors that are highlighted here are important. We need to ensure that we make exit pathways wide enough for the likely number and capacity of users, including people with a disability, and the speed with which users must evacuate given the likely fire load of the building. There's also a limitation for this performance requirement. It does not apply to single occupancy units in Class 2 or 3 buildings or Class 4 parts of a building, because occupants are likely to be familiar with the layout of the building and will know where and how to quickly reach the exits. DP7 Evacuation Lifts is also a qualitative performance requirement. Note the words appropriate to. There is a range of critical factors applying to this performance requirement as highlighted here. We need to consider each critical factor. For example, how far occupants have to go to reach the lift, how many people are likely to need the lift, other fire safety systems in the building, how long it will take to evacuate occupants using the lift, and how reliable the lift is likely to be. DP9 requires that the building has an inbuilt communication system for entry, information and entertainment, or for the provision of a service that must be suitable for occupants who are deaf or hearing impaired. This is a qualitative requirement. Note the words be suitable. A limitation also applies to this performance requirement. It does not apply to a Class 4 part of a building. It also does not apply when an inbuilt communication system is only used to broadcast emergency warnings. DTS Provisions D3 Access for People with a Disability. Let's have a look at subpart D 3.0, Deemed to Satisfy Provisions. This is like an overview on applying part D3. D3.0 is basically outlining how a DTS solution under this part can meet a number of performance requirements. It also covers the use of performance solutions. Let's look at the three clauses here. Clause A. This is the general statement of what is required for a compliant DTS solution and outlines what performance requirements can be met by complying with specific DTS provisions as per AI. If a DTS solution meets all of the DTS provisions in D1, D2 and D3 as appropriate, then it is deemed compliant with 8 of the 9 performance requirements in Section D, i.e. DP1 to DP6 and DP8 and DP9. Note in subclauses II to V that there are additional provisions that may apply for certain buildings. These provisions include Section G ancillary provisions and Section H special use buildings. All other provisions in D3 must be complied with. Clause B. You can use a performance solution to meet one or more of the performance requirements. Remember that the NCC provisions must be applied holistically, so implementing a performance solution to meet one requirement may impact on other performance requirements, DTS solutions, or performance solutions. Clause C. There's no need to develop a DTS solution or a performance solution for DP7, unless lifts will be used to evacuate occupants from a building. Now let's practice locating and interpreting information about the DTS provisions in Part D3. Let's now look at some questions to test your knowledge. Question 1. According to Part D 3.1, what parts of a Class 2 building must be accessible as defined by the NCC? Table D 3.1, requirements for access for people with a disability. Access is required to common areas within the building, from a pedestrian entrance that must be accessible to at least one floor containing single occupancy units, and to the entrance doorway of each SOU on that level. To and within not less than one of each type of room or space for use in common by the residents, including a cooking facility, sauna, gymnasium, swimming pool, common laundry, games room, individual shop, eating area, or the like. Where a ramp complying with AS 1428.1 or a passenger lift is installed, A. to the entrance doorway of each SOU, and B. to and within rooms or spaces for use in common by the residents that are located on the levels served by the lift or ramp. Question 2. According to Part D3, what areas are not required to be accessible in a Class 2 to 9 building? Part D 3.4 exemptions. The following areas are not required to be accessible. A. An area where access would be inappropriate because of the particular purpose for which the area is used. B. An area that would pose a health or safety risk for people with a disability. And C. Any path of travel providing access only to an area exempted by A or B. For example, you would be unlikely to need to provide wheelchair access to a diving platform in a swimming pool because it would be dangerous to use a wheelchair on such a ramp. Question 3. According to Part D3, how many parking spaces would need to be reserved for people with disability in a shopping centre with parking for a total of 1,200 cars? Part D 3.5 accessible car parking. Table D 3.5 car parking spaces for people with a disability. 22 car parking spaces for people with a disability are required. So we divide 1000 by 50, which gives us 20 spaces, and 200 divided by 100 gives us 2 spaces, for a total of 22 spaces. Question 4. According to Part D3, what Australian standard must signage in an accessible building comply with? Part D 3.6 signage, various clauses. AS 1428.1 Design for access and mobility, general requirements for access, new building work. Question 5. According to Part D3, when are tactile ground surfaces indicators required in a Class 2 to 9 building? Part D 3.8 Tactile Indicators, Clause A, must be provided to warn people who are blind or have vision impairments that they are approaching any stairway that is not a fire isolated stairway, and any ramp that is not a fire isolated ramp, step ramp, curb ramp or swimming pool ramp, an escalator or passenger conveyor or moving walkway. If there are no suitable barriers, an overhead obstruction less than 2 metres above floor level other than a doorway, and an access way that meets a roadway next to a pedestrian entrance to a building if there is no curb or curb ramp at that point, excluding a pedestrian entrance serving an area covered by exemptions D 3.4 and areas exempted by D 3.4. Question 6. An auditorium that can accommodate up to 650 people has a hearing augmentation system that uses receivers. What percentage of the floor area must be covered by the hearing augmentation system? How many receivers are required in the auditorium? Part D 3.7 Hearing Augmentation, Clause B. The hearing augmentation system must cover at least 95% of the floor area served by the auditorium's inbuilt amplification system. This equates to 25 receivers being required, in other words 20 plus 5. Let's look at some key accessibility requirements in Section E, Services and Equipment. EP 3.4 Lift access for people with a disability. If a building is required to be accessible, then any lifts provided in that building must be accessible lifts. E3.5 Landings. If a building that is required to be accessible has a passenger lift, then the landings for the lift well have to comply with the accessibility requirements of Section D, Part D3. This will potentially affect things like the dimensions of the landing areas and the width of the corridors leading to the landing. E3.6 Passenger lifts. Part E3.6 identifies the range of lifts that can be used in buildings. While the range is broad and allows for more cost-effective approaches, especially for small buildings, there are some limits on each type of lift that can be used. Some types of lifts include an electric passenger lift, a stairway platform lift, which follows the flight of stairs on fixed rails at one side, a low-rise platform lift, an inclined lift. Table E3.6b provides general requirements for the main features of different lift types, which include requirements for all lifts. They must have a handrail apart from a stairway platform lift and low-rise lift. They must have a minimum lift floor dimensions of 1400mm by 1600mm if they travel more than 12 metres, and 1100 by 1400mm if they travel less than 12 metres. They must have lift landing doors at the upper landing apart from stairway platform lifts, and they must also have automatic audible information within the lift car to identify the level each time the car stops if they are to serve more than 2 levels. E3.8 Residential Care Buildings. This only applies to a Class 9C residential care building. In these buildings, there is a high likelihood that some of the occupants will not be able to evacuate on their own. Therefore, the building's design and construction needs to take this into account. If any occupants might need to evacuate from a level that doesn't go directly out on the street or some form of open space, then the provisions shown must be met. Let's look at some key accessibility requirements in Section F, Health and Amenity. In FP 2.1, Personal Hygiene Facilities, we can see here that suitable sanitary facilities for personal hygiene must be provided in a convenient location within or associated with the building to the degree necessary to appropriate to the function or use of the building, the number and gender of the occupants, and the disability or other particular needs of the occupants. A convenient location means the occupants must be able to reach them easily. Within or associated with the building means not necessarily in the building, as long as they can be easily reached from the building itself. In F2.2, calculations of the number of occupants and facilities, the number of sanitary facilities required in the building is based on the maximum number of persons who will use the building. It is calculated by floor space using table D1.13, unless there is a better way to do it. Unisex facilities for use by people with a disability can be counted as one facility for each sex. E.g., if a building needs 5 closet pans per gender and it has one unisex facility, then it needs 4 other closet pans per gender. In F2.4, accessible sanitary facilities, the general term accessible sanitary facilities refers to accessible unisex sanitary compartments, generally referred to as accessible unisex toilets, not disabled toilets, or accessible unisex showers, or toilets suitable for people with ambulant disabilities. Part F2.4 sets out where accessible unisex sanitary compartments and unisex showers are required to be provided, as well as the requirements for ambulant accessible toilet cubicles. Generally, accessible unisex sanitary compartments must be provided in buildings required to be accessible and containing toilets, and on every accessible story where there are toilets. Some individuals may require assistance using a toilet. Accessible toilets are therefore required to be unisex to allow for assistance by someone of any gender without entering an area reserved for a specific gender. Circulation spaces and features of an accessible unisex toilet must comply with AS 1428.1, Design for Access and Mobility, General Requirements for Access, New Building Work. While the NCC only requires a closet pan, wash basin, shelf or bench top, and a sanitary towel disposal bin within a toilet, if other fixtures and fittings are included, such as a soap dispenser or mirror, they must also comply with the requirements of AS 1428.1. We also need to consider ambulant access toilets. A person with an ambulant disability is someone who's able to move about without the need for a wheeled mobility device, but would benefit from a raised pan and handrails to assist in raising and lowering. F2.9 Accessible Adult Change Facilities. The NCC requires accessible adult change facilities to be provided in some Class 6 shopping centres and some Class 9B buildings depending on their purpose, floor space area and design occupancy levels. This requirement is primarily targeted at large public buildings including shopping centres, sports stadiums, aquatic centres, museums, art galleries and airports. Part F2.9 in conjunction with Specification F2.9 sets out the particular requirements and specifications for accessible adult change facilities. Let's now look at some questions so we better understand how to interpret the DTS provisions in Part F2. Question 1. According to Part F2, what facilities or elements must an accessible unisex sanitary compartment contain? F2.4 Accessible sanitary facilities. An accessible unisex sanitary compartment must contain a closet plan, wash basin, shelf or bench top, and means for disposing of sanitary products. Question 2. According to Part F2, where and how many accessible unisex sanitary compartments must be located in a Class 5, Class 6 or Class 7 building? Part F2.4 Accessible sanitary facilities, Table F2.4a Accessible unisex sanitary compartments. If closet plans are required according to F2.3, then one unisex sanitary compartment must be located on every story that contains sanitary compartments. If there is more than one bank of male and female sanitary compartments on any story, then one unisex sanitary compartment must be located at not less than 50% of those banks. For example, if there are 4 sets of sanitary compartments on a floor, then at least 2 of those sets must have an accessible unisex sanitary compartment. Question 3. According to Part F2, where and how many accessible unisex showers must be located in a Class 5, Class 6 or Class 7 building? Part F2.4 Accessible sanitary facilities, Table F2.4b Accessible unisex showers. If one or more showers are required according to F2.3, then there must be at least one accessible shower for every 10 showers or part thereof. So, for example, if there is 1 shower required, then it must be an accessible shower, or there must be an additional accessible shower. If 2 showers are required, then 1 must be an accessible shower. If 10 showers are required, then 1 must be an accessible shower. If 11 to 20 showers are required, then 2 must be accessible showers. If 21 to 30 showers are required, then 3 must be accessible showers. Question 4. Where in Part F2 will you find requirements for hoists, change tables, changing rails, and signage in an accessible adult change facility. Specification F2.9 Accessible Adult Change Facilities. Clause 3 is hoists, Clause 7 deals with change tables, Clause 8 is changing rails, and Clause 10 is signage. In which section and part will you find the DTS provisions related to accessible passenger lifts, sanitary facilities for people with disability, car parking for people with a disability, general access requirements for people with a disability, hearing augmentation systems, and access in public transport buildings. Pause this video and look up the relevant section and parts before continuing to see the answers. Assessment methods for accessibility. Whether you choose to use a DTS solution or a performance solution or a combination of the two, you may need to provide some evidence that the proposed solution complies with performance requirements. The NCC recognises 4 valid ways of assessing possible compliance solutions, which are shown here. All 4 methods can be used to demonstrate compliance with all or part of the performance requirements when you are using a performance solution. Evidence of suitability and expert judgment can be used when you are using a DTS solution. The various accessibility rated sections and parts of NCC Volume 1 include a number of relevant verification methods, each of which can be used in certain circumstances. Let's look at some questions to confirm your understanding of verification methods for accessibility. Which of the access-related verification methods in Volume 1 could you use in each of the following circumstances? Question 1. To verify that the proposed number of sanitary facilities in a building complies with FP 2.1. FV 2.1 Sanitary Facilities. Question 2. To verify compliance with access requirements to and within a building using a reference building. DV2 Access to and within a building. Question 3. To verify compliance with the requirements for the slip resistance of a wheelchair ramp. DV3 Ramp gradient, cross-fall, surface profile and slip resistance for ramps used by wheelchairs. Let's have a go at applying the accessibility provisions by looking at a typical building covered by Volume 1. This is a multi-storey office building with 2,300 square metres floor area. It has kitchen and shower facilities on each floor and entry from street level with underground parking. So let's ask ourselves the key questions pertaining to the accessibility requirements for this building. We need to consider what classification is the building, are there common areas in the building, what are the principal paths of travel within the building, which accessibility related performance requirements would apply, what DTS provisions would apply. For example, how would you calculate the number of accessible sanitary compartments required in the building, and also what requirements could apply to passenger lifts, evacuation lifts, signage and hearing augmentation, and sanitary facilities. Which aspects of the building do you think require the greatest consideration? How can the requirements be met so that the building occupants and visitors are provided with safe, equitable and dignified access to and within the building? Take a moment to consider these questions. There are some other useful resources that can be accessed. Compliance with AS 1428.1, Design for Access and Mobility, General Requirements for Access New Building Work is mandatory if you've chosen to use a DTS solution and this standard is referenced in the applicable provision. Use of the Guide to NCC Volume 1 and the Handbook is not mandatory. They provide guidance and help, but nothing in them needs to be complied with in order to comply with the NCC. So, in summary, Section D, Access and Egress, contains the main provisions relating to accessibility in Volume 1 in Part D3. It contains how people enter and move around the building, accessible car parking, and also covers safe evacuation during an emergency. Section E, Services and Equipment, contains accessibility of passenger lifts and lifts used for evacuation. Section F, Health and Amenity, contains accessible sanitary facilities and accessible adult change facilities. Section G, Ancillary Provisions, contains additional DTS provisions for buildings in alpine areas, buildings with atriums, and occupiable outdoor areas. And finally, Section H, Special Use Buildings. This contains DTS provisions for accessibility in passenger use areas of public transport buildings. There are a number of key points for the presentation. The overall aim of accessibility provisions is to provide safe, equitable and dignified access to a building and its services and facilities. This is more than just ramps and wheelchair access. You need to consider how a building is likely to be used and by whom. Accessibility provisions apply to new buildings and upgrades to existing buildings with some concession under the premises standards. Accessibility requirements can be met using DTS provisions or performance solution, and there are several specified verification methods. This brings us to the end of this presentation. Thank you for viewing this NCC Tutor module. Check out the other NCC Tutor modules available to build your understanding of the NCC.